Hi there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. Today, I want to take you through finishing a bunch of quilts. That's a whole lot of quilts. Let me take you along and show you what I did. I am going to post links for all of the quilts that I am finishing here so you can see the original video of how they were made. This is about 1.5 years worth of quilt tops. I've saved them up. I've procrastinated, I admit it. Completely finishing all these quilts took me about 6 weeks altogether. For most of the quilts, I used my walking foot that came with my Singer sewing machine. I call this first quilt Gold Christmas. It measures 49 inches by 49 inches, and I used a serpentine stitch to go over the seams to quilt this quilt. And I took the rest of the pins out after I finished all my stitching. And here's a portion of that finished quilt after it's been washed and dried. Next up was my scrappy quilt with mismatched tree shapes. This quilt measured 59 inches by 66 inches, and I used the serpentine stitch to quilt this one. And you may notice I start my first line in the middle of the quilt, and then I move to one side, then I flip the quilt around and do the other side, starting from the center, moving out. And here is a look at that finished quilt after washing and drying. Next up, I have this Drunkard's Path template quilt in blues and greens, and that measured 43 inches by 60 inches. For this one, I started the center line on the diagonal, so I continued making diagonal serpentine stitches all across the quilt. First the right hand side, and then I flipped the quilt around and did the opposite side. Next up, I used that Drunkard's Path template again, but this time I used multicolor blocks. This quilt measured 51 inches by 60 inches. I decided to do my serpentine stitch kind of echoing the shape of the curve. Next is the teal colored chevron quilt, which finished to about 43 inches by 60 inches. To quilt this one, I used a zigzag stitch. Next, we have a little quilt I made out of shirts. It measures about 42 by 50 inches. I started in the center with this quilt on the diagonal and just started sewing lines across the blocks. Again, I start in the middle and work my way to the outside. Once I get some broad lines drawn, then I will go back sometimes and fill in lines a little bit closer to each other. The next quilt I'm calling Scrappy Squares with a piano key border. This one measured 52 inches by 52 inches. I thought I would have a little bit of fun quilting this one. I started in the very middle of this quilt where the 4 giant blocks come together, and I just started going around in a square with a zigzag stitch. I kept going around and around my previous squares. I never broke thread unless it was to change the bobbin. Going from the middle to about maybe 10 inches or so out from the middle was really a pain. Turning this quilt, every little line I did, I had to turn it, sew some more, turn it, sew some more. But by that time I got about maybe 10 to 15 inches away from the center, it became much easier. And I'm not measuring too closely, but I am using my little 2.5 by 8 inch ruler just to kind of keep these lines about the same distance from each other. I also changed up the stitching on this quilt. As I got closer to the outside, I used a few of my embroidery stitches that are built into my machine, the serpentine stitch, and a little bit of straight stitching as well. Because I did so much stitching on this quilt, it really did take me quite a bit more time than some of the other ones. Next up, we have a Scrappy Square quilt with some sashing. That one measures 52 by 64 approximately, and I used an easy serpentine stitch to quilt this one. I stitched this one diagonally as well with that serpentine stitch, and I started in the center and worked my way to the outside with broad strokes, and then I went back and filled in some additional stitching between previous lines. Next is the brown chevron quilt. That one measured about 54 inches by 64 inches, and I used a zigzag stitch to quilt this one. And again, I started in the middle of this quilt and worked my way to the outside on one side first, then flipped the quilt around and did the opposite side. Those polka dots really made it pretty easy to stay in a straight line. And I forgot to mention the backing that I used for this quilt was fabric that I found at a thrift store. So that was very cool. Well, I thought I'd take a look at how far I'd come and show you. This is the pile of quilts I've finished or are ready to quilt. I've pinned them, I've got them ready to go. Here is my list. I have cross-referenced 2 or 3 lists trying to keep everything straight. It was quite the challenge. Next up is my wedding dress sampler quilt. And that one ended up measuring about 54 by 67 inches. I decided to use a serpentine stitch to quilt this one as well. And these are all 9 patch blocks, so all I had to do was line up my stitch with the seams between these 9 patches. The backing I used for this is a gray king-size sheet that I found at a thrift store. Next, we have a really pretty layer cake with these bright blues and greens and the black and white. And I used a straight stitch to quilt this one. Next up was this Christmas strip quilt. This one is a very large one. I made it with fat quarters and it is 68 inches by 89 inches. I used a combination of stitches to quilt this quilt. Now I've not only got the pile out in the hallway, I've got this pile on the tabletop of finished quilts ready to trim and bind. Well, next up, I made 4 different strip quilts out of jelly roll sized strips. I'm going to take you through one of them. They measured 50 by 80, 57 by 77. They measure, and the third one was 59 by 77. And there was one more that was 58 by 80. So they turned out very large. A couple of them are even twin size. And once again, I started in the middle of the quilt and worked my way to the outside, just making these stitch lines. The next quilt I'm ready to finish is Modern. It measures about 64 inches by 64 inches, and this is the one where I cut my layer cakes wrong, so I came up with a different pattern to make this quilt. I decided to try starting in the middle again on this one and just making squares around and around. The next quilt is my Merrie, M-E-R-R-I-E, England quilt. That one ended up at 50 by 62 inches approximately, and I used straight stitching to quilt this one. And this is another one where I started in the middle, and I had that giant block in the center of this quilt. And I started in the center with that, going around and around and around, making squares. I called this next quilt Blue Borders, It measured about 54 by 66 inches, and for this one I mostly used that serpentine stitch to quilt. Next is a quilt with a red plaid print as the center of my little blocks, and that one measured about 42 inches by 62 inches. And I decided to quilt this one diagonally with a serpentine stitch. Again, starting from the center of the quilt and working my way out, I used the square block corners to line up my lines, and then I went back and filled in extra lines. Next up is this cute little sunflower stars quilt. It measures 48 inches by 48 inches. And with these square blocks, I'm going to quilt this diagonally from corner to corner of the square blocks. Once I get to the outside edge, I go back and fill in a few lines between the first set of lines. Next up, we have another layer cake quilt that I made. It's a really beautiful layer cake that I used to make this quilt, and I've got this really pretty dark blue backing. I'm going to be using a zigzag stitch to go over all these seams. Then I'm going to free motion quilt some flowers on each layer cake. Here is what we have so far. My batting wants me to stitch no more than 4 inches apart, so I really do need some stitching in the middle of these layer cakes. So that's why I decided to just free motion quilt a little flower. I swapped out my foot for this free motion quilting foot, got my machine set up for free motion, and here you can see I am just doing some free form little flower petals, and then I would end up on subsequent flowers, not this first one, I would go around the center of the flower a few times to make a little center of the flower as well. This next one is the Twin Sisters block, and this quilt measured 50 by 50 inches. I used the serpentine stitch to go diagonal across this quilt, and then I went back in and filled in closer lines. Next we have this scrappy herringbone quilt, and it measured approximately 62 by 64 inches, and I quilted this one with a zigzag stitch. Now I'm interspersing the pictures of the quilts after they have been bound and washed, but I did all the trimming, binding, and washing all at once over the course of about a week. Well, the next quilt is the Christmas Bricks quilt that I made out of fat quarters. This is another large quilt. It measured about 63 by 78 inches. I used the simple serpentine stitch to quilt this one. Well, it was time for Blaze to move because it was time to quilt this 1930s quilt. This quilt is very heavy and very huge. It measured approximately 75 by 92 inches. Well, this one was hard to manipulate through my machine, but I did it. I used a simple zigzag stitch to quilt the whole thing. I tried to tack down as much as I could. There were some rips and tears, and after it came out of the wash, I identified a couple of more rips, one pretty big, but I just top stitched over those after they came out of the wash, and a nice satin stitch or some other kind of stitch is as good as a patch. This 1930s quilt is really something special, and I'm super happy that my son and future daughter-in-law are going to take this. All right, let's talk about tie-dye. This is another one of my favorites. The backing on this is an old sheet I found at a thrift store. I bought a sheet at a thrift store and I tie-dyed it. The whole sheet, I tie-dyed it. It was awesome. This quilt top measures about 71 inches by 81 inches, and I used the serpentine stitch to quilt it. I really do love this tie-dye quilt. It's so cool that I tie-dyed it myself, and then I made the quilt myself. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. It feels really good to have these quilts ready to donate. They're ready to go and move out of the house. If you're enjoying my channel, I invite you to subscribe and hit that notification button. You'll get notified when I post new videos. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again real soon.